Hello and welcome back to this Downplay Duelistic Crusade. In this video I'm going to review Kino Lorber's release of a beautiful new scan for one of the vastly underrated and little seen or discussed James Whale films outside of his iconic horror films. This from his incredible period at Universal where he had the full patronage and support of the studio because he had the Laemmles behind him, particularly Carl Laemmle Jr., son of the studio founder and owner called Carl Laemmle Sr. And with this film, 1933's The Kiss Before the Mirror, you still have many of, in fact, I'd say all of the James Whale flourishes and part of his style that we all know and love, and in terms of the horror films. So this has that sense of class and style and elegance, but it's also filled with quirky characters and a definite sense of the macabre and that particular very biting, dry, whimsical black humor that permeates the James Whale filmography and the horror films, and it came more and more to the surface as he got more and more control and had more freedom to really go into material that he wished to do. So, and it helped, of course, having the original 1931 box office breaking Frankenstein behind him, which only encouraged the Laemmles to further support Whale's whims and ideas. And if you ever want to use the term auteur, even though it gets bandied about far too much and the whole theory has been taken way, way too far, if anyone ever represented the definition of the term auteur in terms of being a director who involved himself in every single aspect of the production of a film, and when you see the film you feel as if you know them better and you've spent time with that person, that is James Whale at his period at Universal, where he had the full support of a studio behind him, and going all the way up to and including the 1936 version of Showboat, which is really the last film he was able to do with the full support of a studio and fully engaging his own artistic desires, because after that the Laemmles lost the studio and he lost that incredible patronage. So it's really one of the great examples of director and studio being unified, and unfortunately for him and for us cinema nerds, he never recaptured that, and so he basically had to work off his various contracts, did a few other films, and it essentially disheartened him to the point that he essentially quit the industry and retired prematurely before his death in 1957. So it's really one of the great losses, I think, in terms of cinematic geniuses, because Whale is one of the legends and geniuses, and thankfully at least some of his films are still discussed and talked about, the horror films, but he has an entire body of work outside of that, and it has his name all over it. You know, it's got his style imprinted all over it. But it's fascinating finally being able to see restored versions of these other films and see the whaleisms, if you will, outside of the iconic horror films. And this film is somewhat representative of the other types of films he would do. It is based on a stage play. It is very European in nature. The storyline is very, very much of its time and very dark and very much based in social hierarchy and class society. And it was made really just before he would go and do The Invisible Man, and it does have some influence on that film, I think, in terms of the way he had already developed his camera style, some of the settings and locations, and even especially the opening. The opening will very much make you realize you're in James Whale land, because we get to a very impressive looking house set that is filled with flowers. That was something Whale was known for. He always loved filling sets or filling his films with fresh cut flowers everywhere. But it's also got the camera prowling through the sort of breakaway walls from one room to another to follow the action, which is something Whale is very much known for. And both of these you will see in The Invisible Man in particular. And of course it helps that the opening sequence is featuring Gloria Stewart, who appeared in several Whale films, but especially The Invisible Man, in addition to The Old Dark House. So this very much fits in the Whale sort of style, but it is more a good representation, I think, of the other films he would do at Universal outside of the horror films. it's also difficult to talk about these films because they've had a terrible release history. I first saw this film, I'd only seen it once before, and it was in a really terrible version. So there's actually quite a number of whale films that I haven't seen, even though I really want to, because I don't want to experience them first in a really terrible version. But there are some that I've just gone ahead and done it because that was the only available option. Now, thankfully, this has been done seemingly as part of Universal's catalog overhaul, where they've really turned their restoration department around and gone from producing some of the all-time worst video masters over and over and over again to doing really archival-based transfers and really digging into the library. Not all these are, well, the vast majority of these haven't gotten releases, but at least they're doing it to future-proof the classic library, which is what all studios should be doing. And unfortunately, it hasn't become viable to a lot of corporate owners until the rise of streaming and the notion of needing to provide titles for streaming services to then be able to monetize them. So this film has not had the greatest of release history, and also most fascinatingly, Whale had to actually remake it as part of his later trying to work off his contract. So he actually remade the film under the title Wives Under Suspicion in 1938. So you have this film for 1933 being a full-on pre-code experience with many pre-code flourishes that it adds to the joy of seeing a pre-code film when you see stuff that makes your jaw drop because you're like, there's no way this would have gotten through just a year or two later. No way. In fact, I find it very strange this film even got remade under the code. It was heavily changed, of course, and it's a fascinating example of seeing a director still trying to bring creativity to the code era, but also at a different studio where his heart is clearly being crushed day after day after day. It still has some sparkle to it. It is a different film experience. I think it's important to see both, and I would love to see it also get a Blu-ray. I think all the Whale Universal films really cry out to get a proper video release finally, and I'm hoping they do. There was finally a restoration completed of Whale's butchered version of The Road Back, which was the sequel to All Quiet on the Western Front. That was essentially going to be his next showstopper after Showboat, but the new studio heads bowed into pressure, ironically, from the German government. So basically they were mad that this film was honest about World War One and didn't necessarily paint German interest in the best light. So, like a lot of Hollywood at the time, unfortunately, they bowed to pressure and drastically recut the film and inserted comedy bits and mutilated it. So thankfully, that was finally at least partially restored to its original version a number of years ago, but it has never seen a video release, and I am dying to see that. It's been shown at like one or two festivals, and that's it. So in any case, I'm beyond ecstatic that the other Whale films are seeing actual restoration and actually getting their due finally, because the richness of Whale's style and his passion for storytelling is here in these films as well. So it's not just the horror films. So the plot setup, for those of you not familiar with the film, again, as I said before, this is a very European story in terms of that sort of, I guess it's a sort of cliche that when you describe something as being European, it's much more intellectually driven, and there's a great sense of class hierarchy. So this film deals with essentially with what used to be termed the crime of passion. You have a husband who discovers his wife having an affair, and in the spur of the moment kills her, and then winds up being defended by his best friend, who turns out to be a well-known attorney. The husband is played by the great Paul Lucas, and the attorney is played by the great Frank Morgan. The wife having the affair at the beginning is played by Gloria Stewart, so unfortunately she doesn't have the biggest role, but the impact at the start of the film and that carries out through the rest of the film. So she has a greater impact than what her character's short screen time would seem to indicate. And the whole opening of the film is very much going to set you up perfectly, because it starts and you're not given any explanation of what's going on, but it's extremely atmospheric, and it looks like this beautiful little romantic scene where you have this couple starting to have this wonderful byplay, and then of course right smack in the middle of that scene, that opening sequence, and just as you're starting to think, okay, is this going anywhere? Right there, you get a line, and what would your husband think? And then it immediately changes the tone, and it lets you in on the sort of fun that Whale has been having with you, and it lets you know, okay, we're in a James Whale type experience. It's a world that's slightly removed from reality, but very grounded in humanity, and we can have this really wicked, almost impish sense of humor throughout to help the material really play and breathe, and sort of leap off the screen. So again, don't let the opening few minutes fool you. The gag of the story, what makes the film really tick, and where the humor really abounds, is the attorney is trying to get his friend off. He's trying to figure out how he can defend him, and so he has to get his friend's story. So as he starts to recount the events leading up to him killing his wife in a moment of passionate rage, but as he's telling his story, there to the attorney's unending horror, it starts to remind him of things that he experiences in his own life and things that his own wife does, and it builds to a point, and his wife is played by the great Nancy Carroll, where she is in the exact same position that the convicted man it describes as the moment where he knew his wife was having an affair, when she was sitting before the mirror and beautying herself up essentially, and sort of inadvertently indicated the loss of passion for her husband, and that she's making herself look great for someone else, and that starts the wheels in motion of his head of his jealousy. Well, the Frank Morgan attorney character goes home, finds his wife sitting before the same mirror, and because we know the sort of tone of the story, the audience is just a couple steps ahead of the Morgan character. We can see it slowly start to dawn on him, and that adds to the inherent wickedly funny aspect of the story, because we're always one or two steps ahead. We can see where this is going, and then he realizes that after starting to trail his own wife, echoing the what his friend did, that his own wife is having an affair. And so then as he's deciding to defend his friend, he's also already plotting how he can use this in his own defense, because now he has to go kill his wife too, because that is essentially what society demands. So then comes another layer of the story, that it's also about class structure and what society does to people, and how people seem almost duty or honor bound by the conventions of society at the time, that if something happens, well, you have to automatically go to the next thing on the checklist. So if the wife has an affair, then the husband is supposed to go and kill them, apparently. So it's a very obviously outdated manner of thinking, but again, it goes to the whole crime of passion defense that Morgan's attorney character uses in his court wrangling, essentially. But that is the main gag of the story, that you have an attorney mounting a crime of passion defense of temporary insanity while he is planning to do the exact same thing, and obviously it is premeditated, which is completely undermining his own argument that he's making for someone else who did the exact same thing. So this builds to increasingly higher levels. There's an inherent manic quality in places where the Frank Morgan character gets to, and it's just got this wonderful, charming, bizarrely wicked, impish sort of humor that is full of the macabre, and so it is pure James Whale. You would not mistake this for anyone else, and that is what makes the film special. And in addition to that, it doesn't just simply rest on the comedy, and in its most touching moments, it actually tries to get more at the human condition of the actual characters when they finally confront each other, particularly in the ending climactic scenes. They're sort of able to finally distance themselves from what the societal constraints demand they do in terms of their behavior. And there are, in the quietest moments where these sort of just crazy characters start to act like real people. And in that sense, they start to more resemble the sort of quirky comic relief characters that work with the Frank Morgan's attorney character. And chief among them, the most fascinating character in the film, and really the person who steals the entire picture, even though she doesn't have a lot of screen time, is Jean Dixon as the Hilda character. And because this is a pre-code film, the way that she's played and sort of, I think the term they use in the commentary is coded as, is rather obviously or quite possibly a lesbian character. And again, having something this out in the open and played in such a way, along with the subject matter of this story and where it goes with it, is full-on pre-code Hollywood. There is no way, shape, or form you would get away with any of this after the production code really got its teeth in 1934. And you will see all of this eliminated immediately in the remake Whale had to do in 1938, again called Wives Under Suspicion with Warren William. And that takes a completely different approach and attack on the story material, but it is severely watered down. So it's a perfect example of what the code did to very intellectual and multifaceted stories. And it's also fascinating that this film isn't that long. In fact, it clocks in at just barely over an hour. So it fits in with what even Universal A Features would be doing at this time in the early talkies. They didn't have the longest runtime in the world. And it's really amazing to see how they tell this very multifaceted story. It seems simple on the surface, but it is very, very much multifaceted. It's amazing to see how they're able to tell the entire story in just over an hour. It's a great example in terms of narrative economy. And again, the ending is quite profound. It's not something you quite expect, and you can read it a number of different ways. You can read it from an emotional standpoint, you can read it from a humanistic standpoint, or if you choose to go with the macabre humor that the film has had for most of its running time, you could choose to view it in a very morbid, sort of wickedly funny way, as in it's an unresolved ending. But it's fascinating that you can read the film's ending in a number of ways for a film that clocks in at barely over an hour. So it has the grace, the whimsy, the creativity, and the multifaceted status that all of Whale's horror films have. And it also has a great influence on the films that came after it that he did. And I think it does play into the just greater sense of artistic freedom that you get in The Invisible Man when you compare it to Whale's original Frankenstein from 2 years before. You could definitely tell that in between he was doing films like this where he greater embraced his own artistic sensibilities, and his films started feeling more and more European, for lack of a better term, in that they didn't feel like, well, they never were going to feel like standard Hollywood product. Even his later films, where he was sort of beaten around and had to fill out his contract, you could still get Whale flourishes, so they weren't just entirely studio junk fodder. But he said it would be impossible for him to make something that didn't have any feeling to it. But as he went along in this sort of golden period at Universal, you get this feeling of his films become more and more and more complex and multifaceted and whimsical, and more, at least it feels more like the man himself. So as others have so eloquently put it, when you see one of James Whale's great films, you feel as if by the end of it you've spent the evening with James Whale himself. And I think that goes back to the notion I said before, that if anyone ever defined the term auteur, it was James Whale, because there wasn't an aspect of a film that he made in this golden period that he did not involve himself in and literally make himself a part of. So his personality is everywhere. And there's also a few nods to the earlier films. There's one or two sets that are actually reused from the 1931 Frankenstein, if you look closely. They're changed around, obviously, so you wouldn't spot them immediately unless you've seen Frankenstein thousands of times, as I have. But it adds a particular flavor to the film that makes it feel a bit larger than life, a bit different, and a bit otherworldly, which is something Whale specialized in terms of making his stories feel unique. even if it was a simpler story, if you make it take place in a world that feels slightly removed from our time, it gives them a timeless quality. And he pioneered that on Frankenstein. That sort of not knowing what time period we're in. Is it old-timey type of setting? But it's also got things right from the then current 1930s. It's not quite Germany. It's not quite England. So you don't exactly know where you are. You get a little bit of that here in this film. Outside of a title card, you don't really think of the locale. Another connection for horror fans that makes this an absolute must is this film unites James Whale, arguably and quite possibly the greatest horror director of all time, with Karl Freund, the legendary cinematographer who shot many of the greatest horrors of all time and directed several of the greatest horrors of all time. And uniting the two in a film that's not a horror film, it gives the whole film a particular flavor. This film is unbelievably beautiful to look at, and just from the opening alone, with the camera prowling through a forest that feels very much ripped out of the countryside of Frankenstein, and going into the house set and prowling through the walls like James Whale liked to do, it is a totally different visual experience to what you get with Whale's collaboration with the great Arthur Edison on Frankenstein and the Invisible Man, for example. And it's a sign of how well he could work with different cameramen, as he would go on to do with, for example, John Mescal on Bride of Frankenstein. And again, it's amazing seeing a point of which where you had James Whale united with Karl Freund, who was a pioneer of moving camera techniques and came from the legendary studios in German Expressionism before coming over to the U.S. and trying to transpose a lot of that into the sound films he would work on, and eventually he would direct 1932's The Mummy and the other masterpiece, 1935's Mad Love. So he's no stranger to Expressionism and the horror film, but it is just astonishing seeing him working with Whale, and the visuals of this film heighten the entire experience. In fact, the visuals are so striking, it's a shame the film is not longer, because you wish there was more time to appreciate them. But of course, that would mess with the pacing and the storytelling. But that just adds to the experience, and the fact that this has finally gotten a new scan, it's just it's an absolute treasure seeing Freund's work like this, and again from a new scan for a film that has been kicked about and practically nobody knew or talked about for decades. Again, the entire cast is extremely effective, and of course, Whale was a brilliant director of actors, and in addition to practically everything else, he made it seem so easy. It's like, oh man, anybody could do that, but of course, it is extremely not easy. So Whale is one of the masters who just made everything seem effortless. And in particular, if you look at the actors' careers or before and after this film, this was really sort of a departure for Nancy Carroll. She had been known for other things, and I think particularly musicals most of all, but she was not seen as a more dramatic actress. And in this role as the adulterous wife of the lawyer, she has to encompass many different things. There is some inherent comedy when she's sort of sneaking around on her husband, but there's also moments of suspense and moments of extreme drama as well. And they're all multifaceted. It's not just going from one to the other. They're all interwoven together because the story itself is extremely layered and multifaceted. So, and you can choose to see it a number of different ways. The storyline, the notion of the crime of passion and husbands being essentially hardwired by society to think that if their wives are left alone or not treated well or feel ignored and decide to go elsewhere for affections, that they then have to kill them is obviously not something anybody should ever do, but it is part of a different time period. And the film doesn't just sit there and promote that idea. It is constantly poking holes in the seemingly ordered notions of society, and as Whale would always do, the best and wisest characters are always outsiders, and the film itself sort of takes the point of view of being an outsider looking in at the just inanity and inherent silliness of so-called organized human society. And that is, I think, if James Whale's films had a unifying theme, it's probably that one, which is why the horror films stand so brightly in terms of the realms of horror, and why they're so strong is because most horror films do deal with outsider characters and figures. So don't let the overall theme of the story, don't let the description put you off, because the film is about so much more than that. And again, it's astonishing it's able to do this in such a short runtime, and still being a relatively early talkie in 1933. And this is getting towards the end of the beautiful pre-code era, where you could get away with adult stories like this that are of adult content, adult nature, for adults, written by adults, and made by adults, where you could actually have real thoughts. Before the production code came in and ruined all that, and you had to bury all this stuff and basically get a lot through by winking and nudging at the audience who knew the games you were having to play. So now we come to Kino Lorber's Blu-ray from 2020. So here is the beautiful cover art using some original poster material. This definitely draws you in. It's amazing to get actual poster material on a video release, and Kino does that for most of their titles. This film has not had a long video history. It finally got an MOD DVD release a number of years ago in Universal's line that was done to match the Warner Archives success. I had always meant to get that, but their DVDs were very pricey, and it didn't seem like it had gotten a new transfer or anything. But before I could grab that, this was announced and came out and credited as a new 2K master. So I'm thinking this is, obviously going to be better than the MOD disc, which I'm sure was probably some ancient old standard F master. But I don't think this scam was made for that DVD. They usually, for MOD titles, will use whatever is floating around or sitting on the shelf. So as far as I know, this 2K scan is exclusive to this release. In terms of the picture transfer and quality, to say this is a night and day improvement over how I first saw this film does not even begin to describe it, because I saw this on some random version I found floating around online before the MOD disc came out. It was horrible quality, far too dark. So this is breathtaking, like almost all new Universal scans of titles. Again, it is credited as a 2K scan. It is really beautiful and definitely shows off Karl Freund's photography amazingly well. So it's worth every penny simply for the picture transfer. That's not to say it's perfect. It hasn't gotten a frame-by-frame restoration. You will notice an occasional line or two, a very thin horizontal line. There are maybe 3 or 4 hairs visible here and there that I spotted, and a tiny bit of damage creeps in here and there, and little tiny things like that, and a little touch of flicker in the opening titles, just very slight. So some of that may be baked in, or actually all of that might be baked into the source they had to use to scan. So that's just to say this film has not gotten a full frame-by-frame restoration. There's also one shot that almost looks a little doopy. It's a little soft, but outside of those little inherent quirks, which basically you would expect from a direct scan of a vintage source. This is a breathtaking transfer, and considering the terrible video fate of the non-horror films of Whale's career, and how this film looked for a long time, if you could even see it, this is a revelation. And it's just a beautiful experience to finally see this film with its gorgeous photography look the way it could have looked. So it's absolutely amazing in terms of the visuals, even though, again, it's not a frame-by-frame modern restoration. But in some ways, it's actually better because of that, I think, because if you look at how the classic horrors have been treated by Universal, because they're so iconic, they usually get too heavy-handed in the restoration process. The audio gets over-scrubbed every time. There is some grain reduction and things like that, and some are better than others, but I wish they would get a more hands-off, archivally-minded transfer like The Kiss Before the Mirror did. This is much more like the beautiful Cohen restoration of Whale's The Old Dark House, which is the best-looking Universal horror film on Blu-ray, even though that film was thought lost for decades and was in horrible condition on video for decades. The old Kino transfer was based off a 16mm collector's print, and it was just really in terrible shape. So the irony is now that film has a beautiful new disc release and looks and sounds better than the official Universal releases. So this is much more of a hands-off archival transfer, which is what I vastly prefer. So you can compare this to, say, the release of The Invisible Man, the official Universal horror Blu-rays, and this wipes the floor with it, unfortunately. So the visual quality is still sublime, with some inherent age-related bits of wear and things. In terms of the audio, it is DTS HDMA lossless mono. Kino always does DTS HDMA. The quality of the audio track itself is quite good. There is natural hiss. You do get the occasional thump and one or two maybe slight tiny jumps, like maybe it was missing a frame of audio and one or two very minute spots. But again, all that seems to be inherent to the source. It doesn't seem like they've Universal's gone in and hit it with tons of noise reduction like they've done on other classic titles, which is unfortunately something that is very commonplace amongst all studios today. So it still sounds really healthy, but I have never owned another physical version of the film. I never got that MOD DVD to compare it, but I would assume the audio is quite similar to what was on that release, and it seems like a pretty much a direct transfer of whatever their source was. It does seem to have some bits of natural distortion, I should mention, which is commonplace to obviously early talkies and the highest parts of the music cues, or in the when you have voices that are shrill or the occasional scream or things, you're going to get some distortion in the high end that is natural, and there are one or two spots of that, but it doesn't seem out of place for a film of this vintage. So again, it doesn't seem like this track has been subjugated to a lot of the heavy-handed noise reduction we run into most of the time. So again, I don't own the older MOD DVD release to compare it with, but I can safely assume that it's pretty much the same and hasn't been mucked around with. Now, this is also a bit of a special edition in terms of this actually does have a trailer gallery, which most Kino discs have, but it does have a commentary track, this one by Alexander Hello Nicholas. And unlike a lot of Kino releases where there's a commentary on there and you listen to it and it's not really any good. Well, Kino's sort of hit or miss, depending on who they get. Any commentary is great because they're not done as often anymore, and most Kino releases don't even have a commentary, and they take some time to do. But when you get one that's actually done by somebody who really cares and actually has watched the film and done some research and brings some original thoughts to the table, that's what you go to a commentary for. This one by Alexandra Heller-Nicholas is well done. She has a lot of great analysis bits. She really takes a close look at the film's story. She talks a bit about the production and the performers in Whale and Karl Freund. She has some really interesting thoughts and opinions on the film that do make you think about the storylines much more deeply. That's what a commentary should do. So it's a really great, solid commentary for this release that makes it even more commendable. So again, it's only 69 minutes as a feature, so it's not like you're getting a Blu-ray of a 2-hour film or even a 90-minute film. But don't let the runtime put you off. The importance of this film and the fact that it has a beautiful new transfer when it has been subjugated to essentially being a forgotten film for many, many decades is reason alone to purchase a copy of this, but it's topped off by having a rather lovely commentary as well. So that makes it for me, and of course I'm a James Whale fanatic, so I am biased, and I admit that. This is one of the most important discs Kino Lorber has ever released, which is saying something because they seem to release 100 discs a month almost. But this ticks off all the boxes. It is an unfairly maligned film that has been sort of lost to the passage of time. It doesn't get discussed about very much. It doesn't get put in festivals or shown on television hardly ever. You never see it get discussed. You never see the non-Whale horror films, the non-horror films, I should say, discussed. And this is a beautiful new 2K scan. It has a great commentary. The audio sounds lovely, and it has the original poster artwork. It is a beautiful Blu-ray release. It's frequently in the Kino sales when they do their site sales. It is a must-own title for Whale fanatics, and I'd say it's a must-own title for classic horror fans. If you love the James Whale horror films and you always wanted to see his more obscure non-horror works. Outside of the Criterion release of Showboat, this is the only other really major example where you can see a beautiful new scan, at least some restoration work, and actually get a nice scholarly extra in the form of the commentary. So I cannot recommend this highly enough. It is a must for fans of James Whale, of PreCode Hollywood. It's a really deeply multifaceted story that is far, far more layered and detailed and complex than what the simple synopsis would have you believe. And of course, it's James Whale, so of course it's going to be like that. But it's also wickedly funny. If you're a Whale fan at all, you'll know his sense of the macabre, and that is the undercurrent throughout this whole film, and it makes it play so beautifully, and it really, I think, makes the film timeless. So it's unfortunate they couldn't do a double feature with the 1938 remake Wives Under Suspicion. I hope Kino does that at some point. I hope Kino does all the other Universal Whale titles, because they have their Universal deal, and I hope mostly somebody puts out that reconstruction of The Road Back, because I've been dying to see that for years now, and unless I somehow get a pass to go to the studio vault and look at the reconstruction myself, or it goes to a film festival again, because it, again, only played like 2 or 3 times. I'm gonna have to wait until somebody puts out it on disc, so I'm still, fingers crossed. But one day it would be great to get all the other Whale films on disc, but until then, at least we finally have a sterling example of a PreCode James Whale film on Blu-ray in a beautiful new scan, gorgeous photography by Karl Freund, and topped off by a lovely commentary. So that's Kino Lorber's release of The Kiss Before the Mirror. Again, I think one of the most important discs they have ever put out, simply because this film has been painfully obscure and unavailable on a decent video release for many, many decades. So that is my review of The Kiss Before the Mirror. If you've gotten this release, or you seemed interested in it when it pops up on the Kino web sales, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you're another fellow Whale fanatic, I would be happy to further discuss all of my undying love and adoration for James Whale, which started with the horror films and grew as I rewatched them year after year after year, and read more about the man's work, his career, his supreme genius. And again, I think it is an understatement to say that his treatment after losing the support of the Lemleys at Universal, and his eventual retirement, his early retirement from directing, is one of the greatest blows to cinema as a creative force. I do think he is one of the truly greatest directors who ever lived, and deserves more credit than he ever gets. And he did. Pretty much, he is the greatest director of horror films, I think, inarguably. He was just an incredible visionary, and again, topped off with that inimitable sense of impishly wicked humor that permeates all of his films, but especially The Kiss Before the Mirror. So again, I cannot encourage picking up this disc highly enough, and if you do, it shows support for hopefully getting some of Whale's other titles from Kino. So I hope this has been fun and at least somewhat informative to once again hear me babble on about my love and undying adoration for James Whale and classic films. So as always, I want to close by saying, keep supporting studio labels and boutique labels by buying films on disc. Keep spinning your disc to help keep physical media alive. And thanks ever so much for watching.